from Brooklyn. We're based in Manhattan, part of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. And so just came up yesterday. And
Upstart Collab. What is it?
So we're a field building initiative based on field building initiative. Means that we're working with strategic partners that are impact investors and connecting them with opportunities in arts and culture and creative economy. So recognizing that there's a need to sort of connect these two worlds, not really talking to each other. So we're trying to do some strategic partnerships to make that happen. So we're grant-funded nonprofit.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kara Davis. I am a panel manager for Hacking Arts this year, and I am leading the Financing Your Artistic Venture panel. I'm going to kick it off now to Kathleen Stetson, our gracious moderator. She is the co-founder of Hacking Arts.
How close do I need to get to this? This close? Close, okay. Awesome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much, Kara, for bringing us here to talk about how to finance your artistic venture. I'm really excited for this group of panelists. It's a rather diverse group, and this is a big topic. So we'll just do introductions very quickly, and then we'll jump right in. So I'm Kathleen Stetson. I co-founded Hacking Arts with my good friend, Catherine Hallaby, 6 years ago here at MIT. So this is very exciting to see you all here participating in making the intersection of arts, technology, and entrepreneurship move forward. In my past life, I was an opera singer and an acoustical engineer and a startup founder and an arts tech consultant. And now I am coaching creatives and entrepreneurs to be successful people personally as entrepreneurs and have successful businesses. So to our panel, we have Alex Sarian. He's the acting executive director of Lincoln Center Education. It's the education division of Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, and he's responsible for the organization's learning and community engagement initiatives, youth and family programming, and cultural innovation grants. It's a big department there at Lincoln Center. He's really focusing on audience engagement and increasing access to the arts. That's a big topic for Lincoln Center now that Russell Granite is the acting president there. Russell used to be the head of Lincoln Center Education before this guy. So we're looking forward to hearing more about that. In his past life, he did many things. He's also currently an advisor to South by Southwest, the Varkey Foundation's Global Teacher Prize, and the New York City Center. He lectures on arts education, audience engagement, philanthropy, and has taught multiple courses, including ones at New York University, Pace University, and City College of New York. Welcome, Alex. Angie Kim is president and CEO of the Center for Cultural Innovation, which is a nonprofit incubator for supporting individuals in the arts, artists, cultural producers, creative entrepreneurs, and arts workers, basically the creative workforce. She has 20 years of experience in the arts and in philanthropy. She worked for Flintridge and Getty Foundations. She's a board member of California Humanities and a council member of the American Alliance Association of Museums Center for the Future of Museums. Whoa, that's a mouthful. And she has a doctorate with the topic of U.S. private philanthropy. Welcome, Angie. Ward Wolf is the senior associate at Upstart Collab. Upstart Collab is a national initiative connecting impact investing with the creative economy. It helps impact investors who understand the power of art, design, culture, heritage, and creativity to see the opportunities that align with their values. Previously, he co-founded Recess.io, an online platform for activating recreation spaces for local communities. And And for several years, he's also managed the sponsorship portfolio for NYC Summer Stage and the City Parks Foundation. And he has an MBA from NYU Stern, which we won't hold against him since I have one from MIT Sloan. It's okay. Welcome anyway.
Thank you.
And finally, JJ Kasper is the founder of Blue Collective, which is a private equity and venture capital investment firm in Brooklyn. They invest primarily in early stage and early revenue technology companies, including arts companies. He also runs EXO Advisory, an advisory firm that supports big corporations all the way down to small startups, and Black Napkin, which is an investment firm focused on hospitality. And he has quite the eclectic resume. He's been an entrepreneur, he's done management consulting, he was a lawyer and an academic, and we're glad to have him here. Thanks. So guys, our goal with this panel, really when it comes down to it, is to spark ideas within your wonderful heads about how to get paid making art, and how to create economic value by making art or by facilitating other people making art. And just a note across the whole panel, I would say when we talk about art, we're talking about all artistic disciplines, not just visual art. So I'll just say that so we can say artists and art and be talking about everything. This is a really big topic. We could cover a lot during this panel. Hopefully we will. We could be talking about nonprofit arts, for-profit. We could talk about raising money and making money, which don't always go hand in hand together. We could talk about artists, arts organizations, and the for-profit arts. And so to keep this somewhat structured, I think we will do it that way. First, we'll talk about artists. Then we'll talk about financing for arts organizations, and then we'll talk about ventures and startups that are facilitating art or creating art themselves. So let's jump into it with artists. Angie, maybe we'll start with you. What are the challenges that artists are facing right now as they try to fund themselves?
Actually, can I do it the other way? I'd like to talk about the opportunities, which is,
Good.
I mean, artists, by and large, always struggle to make a living. And for many decades, we've had an experiment in the US to basically do nonprofit patronage support of the arts, or you go into the commercial route. I will say, and I don't use this word lightly, a lot of things have been disrupted, and we're really feeling the manifestations of those disruptions only over the last 3 years. And what I want to say about that is these disruptions are happening, and I don't want to get into them. They're in a report that we did, which became the National Endowment for the Arts 50th anniversary signature platform activity. But there are 3 things that you all need to understand all kind of make sense as an artist. There's been significant demographic shifts in America where now your desire to pursue your passion should also mean that you are sustainable, right? It used to be like, if I'm going to pursue a passion as an artist, I have to sacrifice being able to care for myself and my family. And that's just not the norm anymore, I would say, going forward. And then also demographic changes in America have made it so that people who have long been underserved by dominant systems of, or conventional systems of support in the nonprofit arena and the commercial arena, like private lending, et cetera, there has been clearly a lot of people who have been underserved by those systems, and it's no longer okay for those systems to remain inequitable. I say all of this to say that therefore the role of artists has also, and the expectations for artists have also changed. It's no longer enough, or I shouldn't say it's no longer enough. I'm talking about broad strokes. But for by and large, if you're going to be an artist and you want to be financially sustainable going forward, you do need to be thinking about your relevance in society. It used to be that you could be irrelevant in the sense of, and I don't mean like not important. What I mean is that you didn't have to worry about politics or what communities you were addressing or what's your cultural sensitivity. But now that's not any longer okay. Opportunities to sustain yourself by getting tenureship, for instance, that pretty much has gone away. So if you're not actually thinking about what is my artistic practice as it relates to society and the communities also who have been underserved, then you're going to lose a lot of opportunities opportunities both for nonprofit philanthropic support, but also for financing, which is looking for viable companies and enterprises, whether hybrid between nonprofit and for-profit, or just for-profit, that are looking also for, like, where's your audiences, where's your consumers coming from? So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. JJ, I'm curious, you're on the board of the New York Foundation for the Arts, correct?
No, but work with them quite a lot.
You work with them, great. What are you seeing in terms of the sort of changing face of artists and how they have to participate in new ways with social impact?
So there might be a fellow in the room named Peter Russo, who's also involved in the New York Foundation for the Arts. And there he is in the back. NYFA is an organization in New York that gives grants to artists and has been doing that for a very long time. It's one of sort of the premier grant-making spots, at least if you're in the small yet kind of large ecosystem that is New York City. For the last number of years, they do a business incubator with artists, and so I've heard stuff there, and then through a handful of connections with other institutions in the city, ranging actually from Lincoln Center way back in the day to School of American Ballet, New York City Ballet, Brooklyn Academy of Music, and a few others. I'd actually, I think I'm answering your question. I'd say the following, I think it's keying off Angie's point. There's this funny, almost like, it can turn into a death spiral, but this sort of philosophical loop that artists get into about thinking about their work in a business-oriented way. And most will just say, I don't want to. It's just crass commercialism. You know, if you try to engage in a conversation about social media, or this is changing a bit, but social media, selling online, it's no, I cannot do that. It changes the nature of my work in some way. It fundamentally sullies my work. And it's funny too, because then when you engage on that question, right, you'll say to them, well, why can't you do that? And I'm kind of making this up a little bit, but they'll point to stuff and they'll say, well, it's not like, it's not like Monet had to do that, or Manet, or, you know, you kind of say, well, that's completely ridiculous, right? And historically irrelevant, makes no sense. So the discussion we always try to get into, and Peter used to too, is it's not really about how do you make more money, it's actually about how do you expand the reach of what you do, right? And if you're an artist, and whether it's political or not, I mean, I would actually say the politics is irrelevant to this, right? The whole thing is about if you're an artist, you are an artist because you think you have something to share with the world. If you are doing that it's back to if you do it in a forest and no one's around to hear you, well, who cares, right? And I think that's actually, and so that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, but I agree it's a huge missed opportunity, and there are lots of great artists out there who will, you know, sort of while away in obscurity for a very long time. And I'm sure we get some Van Goghs from that over the 100 years that will come after this, but it's a bit silly in a world like today where you can't actually have immediate reach, or it's a bit odd.
Warren, I'm curious, with your work with artists at Upstart Collabs, are you finding the same kind of resistance to using tools and technology to get the art out there, or something else?
Well, what we're actually seeing is you know, first of all, Upstart is a field building effort connecting impact investing with the creative economy, and recognizing that arts and culture to this point hasn't had a seat at the table of the large and growing world of impact investment and sustainable investing in general. You know, if you look at the numbers, if philanthropic giving in the U.S. is about 430 billion, and arts get about 5% of that per year. It's about 22 billion. Meanwhile, impact investing and sustainable investing is upwards of $8 trillion. And there are just many different ways that artists, creatives, designers, and people across the spectrum can tap into what we refer to as values-aligned capital. And what we really focus on is that creative people solve problems, and a lot of times they are now looking to do that through business and through starting a business. And because of the nature of what they do, that they're very attuned to the human condition, that they care a lot about making people's lives better, the businesses that they're starting are what's called social purpose businesses. They have while they're looking for financial profitability, they're also looking for quantifiable social or environmental outcomes. And so while this is so what we're really focused on doing is trying to lift those people up and make sure that they have the tools and resources available to them, and also recognizing within the world of impact investors and people that are actually managing a lot of this capital, that there are enormous opportunities for them to deploy this values-aligned capital towards creative ventures in a way that they haven't really been able to in the future. So hopefully, very soon that'll start to change.
Nice. Let's jump into some specifics. Can we talk about business models? So for artists, and as we talk about it, any specific examples you guys can give would be super helpful, I think, to the audience. Alex, let's start with the most basic business model that has been around forever in the arts, which is patronage and philanthropy. Can you talk about, maybe give a little context about, patronage in the past and how it's changing moving forward?
Sure. So I recognize as we talk about business models and evolving business models that Lincoln Center may represent the dinosaur in the room, and that we might have a hard time changing it, but it is a model that we need to live with and a lot of organizations are struggling through. And we were talking earlier at the table, and that while there are exciting conversations to be had about the future of funding, that even within philanthropy, that is a conversation that is evolving and changing drastically. And the arts, for the most part, have not been keeping up, or we feel have not been the way we, measure impact, for example, is not keeping up with other sectors that depend on philanthropy, like education, like health, like humanitarian efforts. And so we, I think, have a responsibility to figure out how to have a bigger seat at the table. It's no mistake that we have an acting president at Lincoln Center whose background is in education and community engagement, and that brings an entirely different texture to an organization like Lincoln Center when you have somebody at the helm whose entire career has been based on redefining the relevance of arts and culture in society, measuring the impact that the arts can have on audiences, and then also increasing access to it. So when we talk about those things, access, impact, and relevance, as things that cultural organizations tend to be struggling with, those are things that philanthropy have, we just need to be keeping up. But one of the things that we struggle with the most is that when you look at philanthropy across these other sectors, it is growing. That conversation is becoming more ambitious. It is becoming more adventurous, and for many reasons, particularly because what we find, particularly in individual giving, is that wealth is being generated at an earlier age, and those behaviors of giving are changing. Nobody's going to give you $2 million to put their name on a building anymore, or as much as they might have 30 years ago. They really want to give you money now, and they want to see what impact that is having. And so that puts the onus on cultural institutions, I think, to behave in a brand new way. A place like Lincoln Center, we have 60 years of doing it, so it's about reshifting. I think about a lot of these younger organizations or organizations that are starting that perhaps don't have a legacy of community engagement the way Lincoln Center might, that are having to redirect or course correct so early in their life, and that could be actually a pretty dangerous pivot when you look at where we are right now in terms of our dependency on philanthropy.
So, thinking about, Angie, artists in particular who still do need to rely on philanthropy to some extent, how do they get those dollars? Is it different now than it was before? Are there new ways to have access to that?
Yes and no, really. It depends on, where you're based. I would say most arts philanthropy, I'm talking about institutional philanthropy, XYZ Foundation, et cetera, or your municipal government with artist support, if they have that. Those are, of course, you need to look at their guidelines, et cetera. But by and large, writ large, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. In the sense that philanthropy itself is going through some shifts. And so what I want to say, because we support artists, so I'm going to talk specifically about for artists, we know now that after a generation and a half of experimenting in providing artists with funding through institutional philanthropy, that what it had actually done is push a lot of individual artists into forming a 501c3. And it has actually been really hard for artists, because what you end up doing is, instead of pursuing and deepening your artistic practice, which you may still be able to do, what you end up also doing is you spend a lot of time working with a board of directors, putting out a schedule, and actually, by and large, actually becoming producers of product for your funders. And what that ends up now, what we're seeing is, there's a bunch of artists who went that route and they don't have retirement plans, and they can't even come out of their nonprofit to give it to another generation because they don't really have another plan. And what we're seeing and what we're also agitating for is, let's open up for where philanthropic dollars go, so that artists are not pigeonholed into only being supported through establishing a 501c3. And this is where I'll just unpack a little bit, because you asked about business models. So we know through research that artists who have been able to sustain long-standing practices, especially in underserved cultural communities, African-American neighborhoods in Oakland, for instance, that they've been able to weather whatever the flavors of the month by philanthropy is, because they've had a hybrid business. They might be writing those grants, but they're also doing things that are for earned income, right? Contributed is like, a grant. Earned income is like the money based on your products and services. And what we're seeing, and what we want to actually start to help, is this larger spectrum of financial capital that should be unleashed to meet artists where they are. So some of you are going to hear about Upstart Collab and be like, you know what? I'm a creative social impact entrepreneur, and I want to get funding from Upstart Collab. Or we actually have a triple bottom line funding program in Los Angeles. So for some of you, that's going to make a lot of sense. Others of you, you're going to do a studio practice, you want to be a nonprofit, that's going to still exist for you. Those funders will still be around. And then for others of you, it's like, you know what? I have a product that the way I'm going to have impact is I have to go to scale. Something that JJ was talking about. And the only way I can go to scale is if I get venture money and have investors, et cetera. And what we're trying to say is, we need to celebrate all of that and recognize all of that as actually artist-owned, because oftentimes, I'm from in LA, in California with Silicon Valley, so often what ends up also happening is that artists who go the for-profit route end up starting to eschew their artistic identity. They know they're an artist, but no one ever asks them about it. And so we start to lose, like, what's the flavor of artists in America today, because we've pigeonholed them based on funding.
I just have two really brief reactions. I don't know who in the room is an artist versus who maybe is in the business route, and those things may be overlapping too. So for example, for decades, I know I sing. I also used to sing opera at some point. I used to front a rock and roll band. I play guitar. I paint, all the above, blah, blah, blah. But I have a day job, and I've always had a day job, and I do that stuff on the side, and I make time for it, and that's important to me. And if any of those were ever to take off, maybe I would consider a career change, but they haven't, but I still do it, right? My two quick reactions are this. One, for those in the room who are artists, and maybe there are not so many of those, or maybe there are, but I end up in this discussion frequently with artists, is we forget another option for funding yourself as an artist. It tends not to get talked about, which is have a job. And I mean that sort of sarcastically and also very seriously, which is, if we go back in history, William Carlos Williams was a practicing doctor in New York City for 50 years, wrote beautiful poetry. T.S. Eliot, now we may not like him, some people, he was a banker his entire life, never stopped. There's that funny story where the old art critic for the Times, Robert Hughes, looked up, it was sometime in the early 2000s, and Philip Glass was driving his taxi cab. Philip Glass was a taxi cab driver, I think still may be, it's unclear. Maybe he's driving Ubers now, I don't know, but he was also a plumber for a long time, and didn't stop. I mean, he's releasing, very famous, right? And he's just said, I keep doing this, it's what I do. So that's one. Number two is, for the people in the room who are maybe more business-oriented and say, I would like to solve some of these problems with technology. One thing to think about, and I'm actually keying off a question up there too, I don't know if Patreon is I don't know if it's either of those things, a net good and or a digital Band-Aid. I would say the following, though. Patreon, just for what it's worth, having seen some of the insights of that, a lot of that is pornography. If we're not aware of that, it is. A lot of what goes on Patreon is actually pornography. It's not, maybe that is art too, but it's not artists like we think of the Manet, Monet, Van Gogh, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't necessarily think that's quite the right solution to the world of patronage. I know it's they have a name that sounds like it, but I don't think that's quite patronage. I would say to those in the room trying to think about problems, this is a real problem to actually solve that should be solved with technology, which is legitimate artists of a certain caliber, quality, et cetera, looking for individual patrons, whether those be individuals or governments or states or private organizations, et cetera, and done in a way that, again, is not commercial or crass or otherwise, right? That doesn't really exist today, and would be a huge need. Again, Patreon does not solve that. But anything like Patreon, Behance, et cetera, they're always going to go to the lowest common denominator, if that makes sense. And so there is a need, I think, actually for something that does it at a higher level. Just a thought.
Can I just respond to that? Because we don't see it that same way. Like, and I'm not going to call out just Patreon, but what we've seen is that crowdfunding, online crowdfunding platforms have done something unbelievable in the artist community. So, I mean, going all the way back to the Renaissance and the Medici support of artists, artists never could leave a metropolitan elite geography, right? If you really want to be successful as an artist, you had to go where the donors were. Patreon, Kickstarter, the list is long, but especially Patreon, and we're seeing it also with studio practitioners, but also artistic disciplines that never got formally recognized, like documentary film, et cetera, by like the high art elite still. Those folks are making enough of a living on Patreon that they're going and making life choices of leaving high cost cities for better quality of life towns, and in my mind, actually doing what we needed to be doing, which is situating artists in Caldwell, Idaho, as an example, and actually having a spread of artists so that they're not just concentrated in metropolitan cities. We absolutely celebrate that, so.
Wow. Ward, do you want to chime in on that and or talk about some of the business models you're seeing that, or encouraging artists, you know, past these? I mean, the thing about the crowdfunding funding platforms is, in many ways, crowdfunding is sometimes it's kind of philanthropy, sometimes it's kind of pre-buying something, but I think there's got to be more than that. What are you seeing?
Yeah, and I think you know, I think to Angie's point a little while ago about sort of opportunities to, you know, unleash more capital in general to the arts and how we can be celebrating all these, you know, different vehicles that are out there. I think looking a little bit higher on more of sort of like a systems level, and looking at sort of like gatekeepers of capital that is invested in our communities. One exciting example that, or field that we've at Upstart been really excited to work with is the field of community development and community development finance institutions. In particular, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC, has a 40-year plus track record of lending and investing in low and moderate income communities, and, you know, whether that's providing affordable housing, you know, providing small business loans, those traditionally have more difficult access to capital. And what CDFIs like them are starting to do is recognize the importance of arts, culture, and the creative economy at large as a sort of central pillar to their community investment strategies. And as such, they've released they're raising a new investment fund that's real estate focused. It's called the New York City Inclusive Creative Economy Fund. And what they're doing is they're investing in nonprofit developers in New York City that are providing affordable space for arts institutions, businesses in creative industries, cultural institutions, et cetera, to really, you know, while it's, you know, it's great to have, you know, the arts and access to the arts and have access to capital be geographically dispersed, as Angie was saying, but it's also really important for a city like New York to be able to preserve its cultural character and make it a place where, you know, culture is not just consumed, but also created, because that's sort of what gives it its beating heart. And so through initiatives like that, which is now, you know, really exciting new pool of capital for, you know, creative people in general to tap into, I think is one example of an interesting model in this space.
Cool. Let's talk about other pools of capital, Alex. Yeah, so let's get into arts organizations a little bit. Gosh, time is flying. Yeah, you talked about the importance of philanthropy. It can't be ignored, but what are the other ways that you're thinking of, what are the other places that you're finding money, basically? Or ways that you're creating money?
Sure. So contributed revenue is obviously very important, and Angie mentioned earned revenue. We have to get very creative about how organizations think about earned revenue. What's interesting, so we just launched, or we just wrapped up a report. So Lincoln Center, for those of you who know, we have, our portfolio of programming is massive. You have everything, I mean, literally almost every art form is represented, and you have everything from, you know, as an ecosystem of organizations on our campus, you have everything from a $250 ticket to the Nutcracker to free programming over the summer. So we welcome a huge amount of different people based on what we offer. For the first time in our history, we surveyed and we did research on our audience that comes to us for free. We've never engaged them in a conversation around why do you come here? Because historically, if an audience member doesn't pay, if there's no transaction, why would we care? And for the first time in our history, we said first of all, it's a growing area of engagement for us. It's a growing audience. Our summer programming at Lincoln Center, if you've not been, I think is part of the most exciting things happening at Lincoln Center. They're all free. You just walk in and you dance the night away, you know, 4 nights a week. It's fantastic. But we've never asked them, why do you come? What would get you to come? And we've never looked at our unpaid audiences versus our paid audiences and how do they relate to each other. And what's fascinating is that when you look at our paid audience, and again, I'm generalizing, but they're the audience that will roll up in a car, get out, go straight to their seat, and then come back out and go home. Our unpaid audience those are the folks that are walking around the Upper West Side shopping. They're the ones that are actually buying dinner and investing in local businesses. We've never looked at it that way. And we've never said, how do we engage, you know, what are all those transactions and how is it benefiting the community and how do we get Lincoln Center to be a bigger part of that? So that means, as a very small example, we can go to our local businesses when it comes to corporate sponsorship and say, listen, we now have research to say that when we have, you know, 5,000 people a day come to Lincoln Center and not buy a ticket, they're actually spending more money on a 5-block radius than they are on us. So you actually could contribute to us from a marketing perspective, and that should help you because we can drive traffic your way. The other thing that's fascinating, and I'm going to go off on a rabbit hole, down this rabbit hole for a little bit, is that when you look at these two types of audiences, the folks that are unpaying are saying to us that they have a higher desire to become paying audiences than our paying audiences have a desire to become unpaying audiences. So in terms of like traffic direction, that's traffic direction in the right direction for us from an earned revenue perspective, because we have 5,000 people a day coming to us for free that are saying, if you actually programmed what I wanted to see within your halls, chances are I'd be willing to pay $100 a ticket if I had something that to see that I valued. Whereas people that are paying $100, $150 a ticket, if we said, would you want to come see this big band for free, they'll say no. So that is fascinating because it means that if we can engage them in the right direction, but now it means being relevant. It means responding in a way, and Lincoln Center is, you know, Lincoln Center has been doing amazing things for 60 years, but we've never been asked to respond so much, in part because we've never asked the question, right? We've only surveyed this population for the first time. So what do we do with this information, I think, is going to be huge for us as it relates to earned revenue, because I think that's a huge potential for us when you look at the amounts of people that we have a relationship with. I mean, the Upper West Side in general is evolving. That demographic is shifting like crazy. How do we build relationships with folks and add value so that they can spend money, and that we're inviting them to spend money, and we're inviting them to support us because they find value in what it is that we offer for them. So there's a lot happening in terms of understanding the different types of pools that earned revenue can come from for us.
Yeah, okay, so I love the idea of meeting needs and discovering what those are, and potentially bringing money from outside the arts, like local restaurants, et cetera, into the arts. JJ, do you want to talk about some of the unmet needs that you've been seeing, or that, you know, pain points in the arts that could be solved, that would, you know, create new tools perhaps for artists, or new ways of thinking about the arts?
Yeah, okay, I'm trying to think of what's most interesting, so I keep it brief. I would say the following. it's interesting to me, and maybe I'll use it as an example. I worked with Peter Gale, but Met Opera probably like 8-9 years ago. And Peter, I don't know if anyone knows Peter Gale. Peter came in from, was it Sony? Is that right? Am I getting that right? Came in from Sony to the Met Opera, and actually for a little bit while he was there, had I'd say a bit of bad press, only in the sense of the sort of the Illuminati of the New York City arts world like to say that he was turning this into a revenue-producing center, and how dare he, right? But it was rightfully so that they brought him in, because this was right around the crisis, and people were spending less in general on stuff, and people were donating less to arts institutions, and actually opera's sort of been in its own secular decline in terms of people who know about it and like it, blah, blah. So I mention all that to say there was a real problem, which is how do we bring in additional revenue? And what was interesting to me, and I was only there for a short period of time, and I was there leading a strategy effort with him and the board. What was interesting to me, and I could tell you the same story for many other institutions, I don't mean to pick on Met Opera by any means, and frankly, they were ahead of the curve on a lot of these fronts. What's interesting to me is that same attitude I said earlier around artists, and maybe this doesn't quite sum it up, but I could maybe say it's that funny tension between the dollar motive and the creative motive, which people always use as an excuse, not to get smart about sort of new digital tools, or or they use it as an excuse as to why they're doing badly or whatever it may be. That same thing infiltrates, I think, a lot of the institutions, which I think creates a lot of opportunity for the institutions themselves, but also entrepreneurs. So the example of why I'm bringing up Met Opera was, I remember we were talking about this and we were saying, well, okay, so if you've got a audience problem, let's tackle that the same way we would as a for-profit, and let's use a lot of the digital tools that no one else in your competitive set is using. We look across, big opera centers in the UK. We can look across the few that are here in the States, and no one's using stuff like, this was like 2010, 2011, Facebook. No one's using Facebook. No one's really using AdWords. No one's doing this. And the response, not from everyone, the response though was, can't do that. Well, why? It's too commercial. And every time we come in, there are many examples of this, right? It's just too commercial. We can't do that. And there's another example too. So Met Opera has this awesome app. If you love opera and you don't have this app, you should have it. It's $10 a month. It's called Mood, Met Opera on Demand. It's beautiful. Back in like 2011, I think it was 1080p, which actually many of the iPads didn't even support at the time. The crew there at the time, this may have changed, refused to put subtitles on that. And when asked why, because it degrades the artistic value of the work. And when we asked the audience who had downloaded the app, well, why did you churn? Because most people here probably know the word churn, like customers leave after they subscribed. If you're an enterprise tech company, that's the worst. Like, you want that metric to be really low. I think Mood was doing like 10% month-on-month churn. So do the math, right? They churn through an entire customer set every year, something like that. And the reason they were leaving was, one of the big reasons, I like the subtitles. I watch it and I flip over to my Google, I pull up the translation, but it would be a lot easier if it just had it at the bottom. Again, that may have changed. I bring all this up, and I'm picking up, but I could give you the same story. All the content creators, these big institutions, the content creators and the content owners actually have this amazing asset, which is actually and maybe I'm making 2 points, which are, it's like the current content, but also the existing content, which often exists. Actually, Lincoln Center's done better than most in terms of productizing that. Most institutions in the US and Europe can't. A whole bunch of silly reasons, like union regulations. Brooklyn Academy of Music has 125 years of recorded in some way media, can't release any of it because of union regulations. Totally ridiculous. Could make a ton of money if they could do that. Now again, I'm making 2 points. One is, there's sort of this funny thing that continues to infiltrate even the institutions, which is too commercial, which is just silly to me. I mean, again, you don't have to be dollar-minded, but at least be reach-minded. And then there's that other thing, which is, and I think there's a lot of problems here also for entrepreneurs to solve, which is, how do you actually get this, how do you help institutions get this content out? And maybe use Mood as an example, like kind of best in class, but how do you get this out? Or the Berlin Philharmonic has another great app for those who like orchestra, et cetera. But how do you get that out there and help all the institutions get? I mean, I would love to live in a world where every institution had some really cool, digital center where you could watch stuff from the 1980s, 1970s. I mean, wouldn't that be unbelievable? But it's not there. It's just crazy. I mean, go try to find any excellent recording of even like Mikhail Baryshnikov. It's very, very difficult. I mean, you might find a PBS documentary, and that's about it. Jacques Soto, PBS documentary. That's the only thing you're going to find of him. It's unbelievable. Greatest artist of our time. Nothing. Oh.
Yeah, Angie. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I just want to put a little pin in what you're saying, because I think we, actually all throughout this Hacking Arts Festival, I feel like this just needs to be said. The reason why we talk about like commercial as assigned to like low art and then like nonprofit assigned to high art, that's a total cultural construct, right? And there was a reason for that. I'm a historian by training, so I don't demean it by any means. But this construct came about because America wanted to become elevated like its Western European counterparts, which is why we literally imported all of their ideologies about what is fine art. It's the classics. And if you were going to elevate yourself, right, not sully yourself through like popular kind of things, you had to actually, as a audience member, as a museum goer, et cetera, you had to actually elevate yourself to the level of the art. And the reason why I just say all that is because this does make a difference for artists today. Artists today, you have a choice, and actually there are more choices within that spread of like the high versus low divide. I don't even like to think of it as a high versus low divide. We have reached a point in American culture where there's a number of different cultural traditions that are here, that are part of the new American cultural identity, that is not just about importation of Western European hegemony. Having said that, that should play a part in how you see yourself and your business models. It sounds like a far stretch, but it's not. And I'll just say this, which is, actually, JJ, you brought this up. It behooves, but not only behooves, you are playing a public service as an artist today if you become aware of the different business models that are available to you, that you become savvy or at least have good enough familiarity with learning business skills, right? Budgeting, planning, financing, even self-producing, right? Like, how do you become the manager of your own professional networks? Those used to be in the domain of third-party intermediaries who would take a big cut of your paycheck. If you can actually own those things individually, yes, it's a lot more work, but there is a reason for that, which is that you are no longer kowtowing to a larger institution which confers to you the value that you're important in society. Now you need to be important in society on your own merits. And the reason why I'll also say this is like not only about becoming part of the experiment of how you're going to create new business models and that you're going to build it out for emerging demand. I mean, these folks here reflect emerging demand for artists' work. The other aspect is to be a citizen. This is a moment where artists are the face of the gig worker. We are rewriting our social contract regarding labor. More and more Americans are not going to have the protections and benefits from full-time employers. What that means is the artist's life is now many millions more Americans' lives. And so we actually, as a sector, need to become much more active and vocal in disseminating and advocating for protections for independent workers, because it not only serves us, but helps all of us get faster, farther together.
So let me jump in, because so when you, yes to all of this. One of the things that I find fascinating is that the artists that we work with mostly, while they do need to develop, while they should develop those skills, are pigeonholed into a business model where they're not required to.
Right.
And so you look, for example, at a community of artists. I'm going to pick on Argentina just because I'm familiar with it, where there's no such thing as a 501c3. You know, there are no resident organizations. The money goes straight from the government or straight from corporations into the pockets of the artists, which is fantastic. However, the flip side becomes that the artists are having to write the grants, they're having to write the reports, they're having to do all the work that normally folks like me are employed to do by a nonprofit. And so the flip side of that is that you have an incredibly savvy artist community that are, I mean, I talked to some of my friends down there that are producing, like it's insane the amount of work they have to go through. And their biggest frustration to me when I share what our situation looks like today, they say, man, I wish I could get, like, director of development? What? You mean there's somebody out there that can write grants and fundraise and then just let me be an artist? So I think there's this, you know, like, you know, while I do want to make, you know, I want to acknowledge the fact that, yes, we do need to redirect more funds directly to the artists. And I think in response to that, artists will, you know, will become I hope, a more central part of this conversation. That there are cases around the world where that is happening, where they're looking at us and saying, man, I wish I could do that.
But the other alternative, which we can get into, is what we're looking at as an institution, CCI, is we're looking to see what artists are doing at self-empower in terms of their organizing, how they're coming up to becoming collectives where they share back end. And we're actually, next year, we're interested in actually providing equity, lending, and grant support to artist-run, employer-owned worker cooperatives.
Yeah, Ward, I want to talk about impact investing
Sure.
For the next couple of minutes, and then we're going to take questions very soon. So speaking of artists and the various qualities that they need to have and the roles that they need to play in their own artistic ventures, how do you talk about that with the artists you work with, and what qualities do they need to have to get impact investing these days?
Sure. I mean, that's a fantastic question, and I mean, it sort of goes back to the idea of the pools of available impact capital are sort of waiting at the gates for once more investors are attuned to these opportunities, what those sort of artist entrepreneurs are going to be able to tap into once they sort of are at that stage. And so I think, and just sort of, there's a lot, just to also make the distinction, there's a lot of sort of gray areas in between, or if you're looking to actually scale a creative business, there's a lot of ways that it can be structured, and a lot of ways that you can sort of work through the ownership model, and how you're giving control, and how fast you're trying to grow, and all these other factors. So it's not just either you're trying to take venture capital money and grow like crazy, and then pretty soon you're going to have to exit and lose control of your company so you can pay back your investors. There's a lot of sort of like intermediate steps to that point, and one resource that we frequently direct people to is out of Duke University. At the Case Center, they have a tool called Smart Impact Capital, and it's a really great sort of worksheet to go through for those who are sort of looking to explore what impact capital could mean for their business, and sort of what's the best way to sort of position themselves, how they can define what their values are, and what the things that they aren't going to be willing to compromise when it comes down to that question, because inevitably you'll have to reach a point when you have to decide what you're going to, try to give up, and what you're going to have ownership over when you're trying to scale something. So I think that's just one really interesting and important thing for everyone to consider.
Well, JD, do you have anything to add to that, or you can jump to? Okay, we'll jump to questions then. So. Everyone, if you haven't added your questions, please do that to Slido. Yeah, let's start with thanks. Oh, wow, cool. Let's start with the top one here. Talking about tools, how does the mass availability of creative tools like Photoshop, iMovie, Snapchat affect the economic value of artistic product? And I feel like the second question is somewhat similar, in the tool like Spotify. It makes it accessible, but there are downsides. So how do these tools affect the ability to create economic value and the livelihood of an artist?
I actually see them kind of a little bit separate. The first one to me is more about what's become kind of crudely described as like, the mass of artists, amateurs who are now self-identifying as artists. And I don't see a problem with that. I mean, we know that so many artists, there are so many hidden artist talents and identities, because nobody calls them out as artists because it never reached the realm of the kind of elite definition. What's wrong with a nation where so many people have an artistic identity? Now, there is a very big difference between the kind of art that's going to make it on a museum wall, or that's going to qualify for any of these types of investors, et cetera, but that marketplace will self-organize. In terms of the second one, I actually think yesterday we had people were talking about blockchain, et cetera, and we are looking at this particular one because what we're seeing is this is the wild west of things that are like living and breathing online, right? And so for artists, I think paying attention to opportunities to execute on smart contract agreements that confer you with royalties over time, regardless of how many times it changes hands or the nature of ownership, those are just things to be mindful of and also participate in when the terms are right for you. And that didn't exist when actually Spotify actually started. So these are things that are just happening so quickly that you just need to be paying attention to.
Maybe I agree with Angie on the creator's bet. I like it that people can create more, whether you call them an artist or not. Doesn't really get me too up in arms. The second one, the Spotify one's interesting though, because I always, and this is maybe veering into personal here stuff too, but I always get maybe a little bit up in arms about this when you hear the artists who say, oh, I'm boycotting Spotify, it's devaluing my art, or they're not paying me enough. And, you know, again, it's like Taylor Swift and she's worth $175 million or whatever it may be. And that said, like if we just look at this purely objectively, for anyone here who's been a music lover for the last 40 years like myself, back when there were tapes or CDs, I probably bought 5 to 10 albums a month at that point, I guess. And when I was in middle school and high school, I'm paperboy, and I'm saving up to buy a $10 cassette tape, right, or a $15 cassette, $20 sometimes cassette tape. And now I paid $9.99 a month for Spotify, and I listen to all of that and more, stuff I never heard of. Like, as a consumer, we are in a fundamentally better world in terms of being exposed to all sorts of art forms, getting it to the value that probably makes sense. As an artist, I'll put Taylor Swift in the camp if we want, doesn't really matter. I'll be provocative just because we're running out of time. There's a little bit of tough noogies to that too, right? I kind of have a tough noogies approach, which is that's the economics of it, right? It's not like Spotify is making millions of dollars. They're not revenue-wise, but they're losing tons and tons of money. These guys are not scraping some ridiculous, usurious margin off the top. They're basically paying artists what we're willing to pay them for the music that we get. Now, if everyone in the room says, I'm willing to pay $30, $40, $50 a month for Spotify, so be it. I mean, I'm not going to raise my hand to that. I used to spend that much for cassette tapes, but no way I'm paying that now. So it's, I think in some ways it's like that is the reality of the world. The good stuff of that is consumers are better off. The dollars associated with music keep going up. The amount of minutes consumers put into music and art actually continues to go up, notwithstanding all the Hollywood folks saying, hey, we're losing all our revenue. Actually, minutes spent watching video, watching content, listening to content actually goes up every single year. Like they are the ones getting screwed, but they're getting screwed, I think, for the right reasons to some degree. And the good part about it too is for those artists maybe that we were talking about before, amateur artists, whatever you want to call them, this is good for folks. I mean, I've got friends now who have albums on Spotify that are a nobody like me, and they get like $17 a month or something, whatever it is, right? And 500 people listen to it, and maybe we and a few other friends have it on our Spotify. But that's good. It's nice. It feels good.
Yeah, but who's? Yeah, all right. How much time do we have? All right. So yes, I think we're all in agreement that like the producing of content has skyrocketed, and that is to all of our benefit. Then you talk about distribution and access, and there's a version of that we see even within our nonprofit model is the question: who's paying for access? Right, so who's investing in access? And what we find is that it's, in many cases, it's us. We're investing in the fact that we want to make it accessible to everybody. But in the case that you're talking about, it sounds like it's the artists that are investing. So like, yes, it's great that thousands of people are listening to them, but are they seeing that come in? Are they seeing that money come in? And if not, then they're the ones investing in access to whose benefit. So that, to me, access, I think, is going to become an increasingly more complicated topic, and particularly who's investing in access and equitable access to arts and culture is I think, increasingly more complicated because that has a trickle-down effect into contributed and earned revenue. But if we are going to be going this, if I would love for opera to be consumed by the tens of thousands on a weekly basis. And I wish there was a business model and the platform to have to put that in place. My worry about looking at Spotify as something to take to scale is that artists are the ones, I think, losing out when we talk about that type of access and that type of a distribution model. That's just my 2 cents.
This needs to get hacked.
Yeah, I mean, so my response to that would be the following, right? If you're an artist who has a couple thousand listens a month and you're making it, probably a cent or something per listen, and if you think that audience is of such a nature that you could have that audience independent of Spotify or not, then go for it, right? Put up your site, $5 a listen or $5 a month. So in my reaction also on the, I actually, maybe it's changed now. Mood was always such a missed opportunity, right? Mood was a giant missed opportunity, and frankly, could still be a huge opportunity. Live in HD was the coolest thing ever, still is the coolest thing ever, but never, the investment didn't happen to a point where it actually got the, and I actually, so I look at like things, I look at institutions and go, take that content and turn that into, you know, a spot, like it's the same thing happening on my Apple TV, right? So it's like everyone goes, oh, thank God I don't have to pay $79.99 for cable anymore, and then you say to them, tally up the subscriptions on your Apple ID for all the channels you now buy, HBO Now, you know, Hulu, this and this and this. It's going to be more than $79.99, right? And so I look at it and I go, well, wouldn't it be cool if, like, actually as a consumer now, I had a bunch of channels from maybe audio, however we think about it, but a content perspective, and I've got Spotify for just general mass kind of stuff. Maybe there are a couple bands that do different, like Radiohead or something, and so I pay, you know, $20 every time their album comes out, and then I get my Mood. That's another 10. I like my Berlin Philharmonic. If BAM had an app, I would have BAMs on there. Like, and you could envision, and then like the true believers are paying the extra, but that's sort of the way it should work, right? The true believers should pay more. I don't know. This could be a very long debate.
We have about 4 minutes left. Let's move to this question. The line between commercial and fine arts is more blurred than ever. Is it important to maintain a premium on non-commercial arts, or is it exclusive? And this ties into this other question here: what defines an artist in 2018? Business model or talent? You know, this idea of arts and entertainment. We're talking about all of these platforms, Netflix, Hulu, et cetera, where even Spotify, where they're gatekeepers, right? So how do we think about arts versus entertainment in kind of a gatekeeper world?
I mean, I don't really have, for me, I don't have a line. I mean, someone yesterday said Hamilton is entertainment. I was like, okay, like if that was meant to be derogatory, I think that's really positive. So, I mean, but I do have mixed feelings when it comes to how artists get paid and recognized, right? So this is why I'll just unpack what I mean by the smart contract. We have not yet invented, based on how fast technology and its platforms have moved, to actually protect or confer value, right, dollar value to artists throughout all cycles of production, distribution, resale, et cetera. That is right now the blue ocean opportunity. If you are an artist wanting to hack that, that's happening. There are like 6 blockchain collectives right now just by musicians for musicians, okay? So those things exist, and if you're interested in this, get familiar with them. I look at things like Netflix, et cetera, in 2 different ways. I do see that the popularization of really quality, artistic, meaningful, and moving artistic experiences has now become much more popularly accessible, and I really celebrate that. I look at doc film. That's an industry I somewhat know, and in doc film, you cannot be a doc filmmaker unless you have financial means to afford to be a doc filmmaker. That's a problem because a lot of doc filmmakers want to tell narrative stories about the very people who really need to have their voices heard. Well, and the reason why it's such an expensive medium is not just equipment. It's like, how do you get to these festivals, right? And how are you networked to be in those festivals? Platforms like Huff Video, Netflix, et cetera, have actually expanded the opportunity for self-identifying doc filmmakers to have more chances to use shorter term video content, which is far less expensive. I'm just giving you a simple example, but just to put a fine point on, I'm not right now worried about if it's too commercial, if it's fine art. Commercial galleries will continue to exist. We know the sales of middle income level fine art is, you know, skyrocketing because of online platforms. All of these consumption kinds of vehicles is not a bad thing in my mind.
Anyone else? Okay. Let's end with, we have a minute. Rapid fire. Yeah, is that okay? Okay, rapid fire. If you were to invest or give a grant right now to a startup or an artist, what would they be doing? Who would you invest in? Who wants to start?
I'll start,
Alex.
because we do that with our re-granting program. We invest, the Lincoln Center Cultural Innovation Fund is a partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation, which I think is fascinating for another conversation. But we build sort of community relationships with organizations that are based in the South Bronx and Central Brooklyn that are doing amazing work around cultural innovation, seen through the lens of cultural participation. So how are people participating in cultural activities? And one of the organizations that I think is fascinating is the Bronx Documentary Center, talking about documentary arts, where they are taking projectors and lighting up sections of the South Bronx with documentaries and photography, and are just engaging the community in a way that is just, I think, very powerful and very beautiful.
Cool. Angie?
So I'm actually going to just point you to our website and just to say that we're biased, and I'm going to share this in this way. We're biased that if we're going to be supporting art, we want to support artists. Too often, we have positioned artists as a means to the objet d'art, and I think this is great that there are still support for artistic projects, but we try to kind of create some, room in the other end of the spectrum. So I'll just point you to three things. We have a grant right now, most of these are regionally based, for folks who have a very strong opinion about where the arts field needs to go, and we invest in their ideas. We have another grant for creative social impact entrepreneurs who are place-based. And then we have another grant that basically is going to be for artists, entrepreneurs who have spinal cord injuries, so that we can infuse a social model of disability, right? Like that it's not a problem, that they don't have the problem. It's like the construct around them is the problem, that we're going to position them as actually vital and a contributor to society. I give you those as examples, one, because guidelines are easily available so you can read about them, but also just to say, like, again, positioning artists as solutions, we need more of that right now.
I'm about to wrap up, but I would invest in the fund that I'd actually mentioned earlier, the New York City Inclusive Creative Economy Fund, because you're able to touch the lives of many working artists today in New York City and help prove that this is a model that people care about, and that if it's successful in New York City, can potentially scale across the country in a much larger fund in support of their community development efforts.
Sweet. JJ?
Mine will be slightly different, so I'm coming at this more from the startup funding or for-profit type funding. And maybe the way I'll sum it up is as follows, because we've actually, I was just thinking, this panel's been, I think a lot of the questions and focus have been on, I suppose, both literally and figuratively, the income that surrounds art, but not as much maybe about the wealth or the asset itself. And so I would say the following, which is, I would love to find and fund a startup that is focused on reducing, we'll call it the Gini coefficient in art product. So most of our art assets are held by museums and governments and very, very wealthy people, and most of us don't see any of this except for the random time we visited Smithsonian or the time you find the PBS documentary about Jacques Soto that's in 340p or something like that on your YouTube. I would love if someone came to me and said, take any version. I have a great way, it's an infrastructure process tech product that allows institutions to very quickly create digital content, get it out to the masses like Mood or even different, et cetera, or a way to say, I can get your physical content out to the world. So it's a marketplace for, like another example, I think it's like 95% of the Smithsonian's collection never sees the light of day, something like that. We can rent it out, we can insure it, we can bond it, states can rent it, localities can rent it, rich people can rent it if they want and go up on their wall. At least it sees the light of day. That would be I'd love to find stuff like that. Anything like that's fantastic.
All right, guys. Well, you have your marching orders. Thank you very much to our panel, Alex, Angie, Ward, and JJ. Thanks, Gara, for organizing this. Thanks, Hacking Arts.
I hope they will say that he was obsessed and it was okay. 'Cause we're going downtown, and we feel like running around. Is it really this fun when you're on my mind? Is it really this cool to be in your life? And I'm going crazy, crazy for you. I'm going crazy, crazy for you. I'm going crazy, crazy for you. I'm going crazy, crazy for you, for you.
Every morning you wake up, you have a choice. You can choose to be happy, or you can choose to be miserable. Today, we choose to be happy.
Open your eyes as you dance with a smile on your face.